Decolonizing Cornwall. The idea of addressing the problem Cornwall faces from a decolonizing perspective might seem strange to some. However, recent re-examination of Cornwall's history in relation to the birth of the English state and the lasting consequences of being marginalized from the seats of power go a long way to explain how many of the social and political issues people face today actually came about. For Edward Said, referencing Antonio Gramsci, one possible route to recovering identity is to create an inventory of the traces of the historical process. Changing focus from what one is told about Cornwall by others and examining one's own experiences coupled with a better understanding of history throws up some interesting questions. Questions which, if at least asked and not even answered, begin to empower individuals and communities when dealing with institutions that exert control over their lives. Before asking these questions, though, it's important to address the very idea of thinking of Cornwall as a colony. The simple response to this is that in the early medieval period, Cornwall became a state before the creation of England, resisted assimilation for centuries, and managed to maintain a form of political and cultural autonomy well into the 18th century. Over the centuries, settlers from England may have moved to Cornwall, but the region managed to hold on to its identity as a place apart. As time passed, actual autonomy may have diminished, but its legacy remains to this day. Hence a peculiar constitutional settlement with England, certain laws that only relate to Cornwall, and a cultural revival that looks to the wider Celtic as opposed to Anglo-Saxon world. The other legacy of the way Cornwall developed over time is, left to its own devices for so long, it was ill prepared for 20th century intrusions. Artists in the 19th century were followed by tourists in the 20th century, who in turn are now followed by people wanting to permanently settle in the region as they seek a more relaxed lifestyle. Marginalised for centuries and lacking the clarity of its place in the UK, for example in the same way as Wales, the Isle of Man or Scotland, sympathetic institutions that could protect Cornwall from the negative effect of these new colonisers simply did not come into being. So, returning to some of the questions, we might ask, why are planning appeals that affect developments in rural Cornwall decided by an officer based in urban Bristol? Why does Cornwall's only homegrown university, Falmouth, not offer a single undergraduate course with the title Cornwall or Cornish in it? Why did Plymouth University run the EU-funded Wave Hub project out of its Plymouth campus and only keep a part-time occupied office in Hale? Why is the Daphne du Maurier archive kept by Exeter University in Exeter? Why does centralizing services always mean moving them out of Cornwall? And so on. On the one hand, many decisions of the late 20th century look vaguely mundane or unimportant. The amalgamation of the Cornwall police with the Devon police looks logical in this respect. Bringing them together and headquartering them in Exeter was just common sense. They were both rural forces and the move would save money. But why are they called Devon and Cornwall police and not Cornwall and Devon police? The little slights as well as the major ones have an effect. However, just as the people of Cornwall can be seen as victims of a particular form of colonisation, it's important to acknowledge the privileged position most people from the Western world held in the grand imperialist ventures. We may take pride in the achievements of hard rock miners in the so-called New World, but should never lose sight of the fact they were exploiting land that was stolen from indigenous people. We may talk about Cornish people taken as slaves by Barbary pirates, but at the same time need to acknowledge our participation in the industrial scale transatlantic slave trade. In other words, recovering history and identity has to be an honest and inclusive venture. Decolonizing Cornwall, for me then, starts with asking questions of people who show curiosity in or want to have an influence on what happens in Cornwall, be they researchers, healthcare workers, politicians, civil servants, students, or the public at large.